I wanted to thank all of you for assembling on this Monday afternoon to hear these two wonderful speakers, Lisa Fagin Davis and Claire Bowern. I will introduce them together so that when they're doing their presentation, they're able to go back and forth seamlessly without me interrupting any further. And I'd also like to thank Mike Morand for organizing this. There's a lot of people that want to present in these, and I'm very happy that we were chosen to sign out for this terrible plague year. I think this is, as you said, sort of creative and collaborative, and in some sense, I hope that all of the work that we've done this year is in some sense healing. When I arrived at the Beinecke in 2012, I didn't know the Voynich manuscript existed. The director of the library, E.C. Schroeder, was frustrated by how much attention was being paid to the Voynich, but how little of that traffic contained dialogue between scholars and the public who were fascinated by the manuscript. There were a few real scholars, such as René Zandenbergen, who were focused on the history of the manuscript. A large part of the reason we published the photo facsimile in 2016 was to attempt to engage medievalists in serious conversation about the manuscript. When Lisa began advertising this talk on Twitter, she mentioned the fan fiction surrounding the manuscript and was immediately assailed by several prominent medievalists. But I think we should be grateful that people are inspired by a medieval object as a creative source. My favorite fan fiction posits the Voynich as a notebook left behind by a young adolescent female alien who left it here on Earth when she returned to her home planet. Rather than ridicule this work, I would like us to think about why somebody would present this medieval object as alien, as a notebook, and posit a young adolescent woman as its author. Which leads us to today's talk. Lisa Fagin Davis received her PhD in medieval studies from Yale University in 1993. She has cataloged medieval manuscript collections at Yale, the University of Pennsylvania, the Walters Art Museum, Wesley College, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Boston Public Library, and several private collections. Dr. Davis has taught Latin paleography at Yale and regularly teaches an introduction to manuscript studies at Simmons University's School of Library and Information Science. She was elected to the Comité International de Paleographie Latine in 2019 and has served as an executive director of the Medieval Academy of America since 2013. She is currently undertaking a detailed paleographic study of the Voynich manuscript. Claire Bowern is professor of linguistics in the Department of Linguistics. She is a specialist in language documentation and language change, working with speakers of endangered languages and using insights from language to study how languages and society have changed over time. At Yale, she teaches classes on these subjects. Since 2017, she has taught a class on the linguistics of the Voynich manuscript in the linguistics department. Today, we're very happy that both of them are here, and I will let Lisa take over the screen and begin her presentation. Thank you both very much.
Thank you so much, Ray, for that very kind introduction and for your enthusiasm about our work on this extraordinary object. And thank you to Mike Morand as well for arranging. And thank you to the 376 of you who have chosen to tune in today. Really pleased to see so much interest in this subject. I'm going to now share my screen and kick things off. There we go. Can everyone see that? Yes, are we good? All right, let's get going. So here you can see both my Twitter handle, Claire's Twitter handle, and also Ray's Twitter handle. We welcome live tweeting. Screenshotting is fine. And there is a Q&A box on the Zoom link, rather on Zoom in the tools section, where you can post questions and we will have time for discussion later. So the Voynich manuscript. So I'm going to start with a brief history of the manuscript, as well as a discussion of its contents, the illustrative iconography, the illustrations in the manuscript, something about the script, and then my own work on the manuscript before I kick things over to Claire to talk about linguistic analyses. One of the things that I am so thrilled about to have gotten to know Claire over the last few years is this collaboration between humanists and scientists. And I think that really is the best approach for understanding this manuscript. And it's really been such a pleasure to get to know you, Claire, and to collaborate with you in our work on this manuscript. So as you can see, just from looking at this one fairly typical page of the manuscript, you have these very strange illustrations and an even stranger script, alphabet, glyph set of symbols, however you'd like to call it. We don't know for sure when and where the manuscript was produced, although we do know that it was almost certainly written around in the early part of the 15th century. And we know this because of carbon dating that was done by Yale University maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that what dated the parchment on which the manuscript was written with a 90-something% probability between 1404 and 1438. Now, it's slightly possible that the parchment could be earlier than that date, than 1404. It's possible it could be later than 1438, but it's most likely to have been the animal that produced the parchment was slaughtered between 1404 and 1438. So the early part of the 15th century, and that's consistent with the style of the illustrations. We don't know where the manuscript was for the first 250 years of its existence, or 150 years, I should say. It is thought that it was purchased by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II in Prague in the late 16th or early 17th century. And I have a question mark there because we only have a secondary record, a report that the emperor had purchased the manuscript. We don't know absolutely for sure that it was in fact part of his collection, but it is known to have been in Prague for several decades after that, and to have passed through the hands of several scientists and alchemists in Prague. In the year 1666, Johannes Marcus Marci sent the manuscript as a gift to Athanasius Kircher, who was a very well-known Jesuit scholar in Rome. And we know this because the gift was accompanied by a letter written by Marci, and that is where he mentions that the manuscript had belonged to Rudolph II. But because we don't have any other supporting evidence, we have to put a question mark next to the emperor's name. Now, the manuscript then stays in Rome for a very long time, for hundreds of years, until Wilfrid Voynich, for whom the manuscript is named, acquires it in Rome in 1912. And he then takes the manuscript with him when he and his wife immigrated to New York City in 1919, 1920. So now Voynich has his rare book business in Manhattan. He has several other branches as well, but he is in Manhattan, and he is trying to sell this manuscript. And he wants $100,000 for it, and no one will buy it because it's no one knows. He won't say where he got it. Nobody can read it. So there is a lot of suspicion about what it was and where he acquired it. So nobody bought the manuscript. After his death, it was inherited by his wife, who was a very well-known author, Ethel Voynich. And she then also tried to sell the manuscript for 30 years, the 30 years that she outlived him, during which time his business, his antiquarian book business went out of business. And they had to deaccession their stock, the furniture, shut down the business until basically all she had left was the Voynich manuscript and not able to sell it. After her death, it's inherited by her and Wilfrid's longtime assistant and business manager, Anne Mill. She can't sell the manuscript either. She finally, in a compromise, sells the manuscript to New York book dealer Hans P. Krauss for $24,500. Remember, Voynich wanted $100,000. So this is a pretty big change. So she sells it for $24,500 to Hans Kraus in 1962. And he now tries to sell the manuscript for 7 years. He can't sell it either. Everyone wants to study it. No one wants to buy it. So in the end, he donates the manuscript to Yale, where it is now manuscript 408. That's its official shelf mark. So that, and it has been there now for 52 years, snug in a nice little custom case, tucked away in a very high security part of the building. It does not see the light of day very often because it's very fragile, it's very precious, and it is, of course, very notorious. So that's the history of the manuscript. That's how it got to New Haven. I'm now going to run you through the contents, just so you get a sense of what's actually in the Voynich manuscript. We start with about 50 pages of plants. It's an herbal, which is a fairly well-known type of manuscript that you might find in the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, where you draw plants, you discuss how to cultivate them, how to harvest them, and what you can do with them in terms of medicinal use or in recipes and various other things. So that's almost certainly what we're talking about in the first part of the manuscript. Even though we can't read it, it's quite likely that when someday we can in fact read this, what we will find are descriptions of these very fantastic and very difficult to identify plants. The next section is astronomical and astrological in nature. All of these circular diagrams and foldouts from the center of the manuscript with stars and suns and moons and that don't correspond to anything that we might see in the night sky, which actually plays right into the fan fiction that Ray was talking about. It's such a lovely idea. And I've read that story. It's quite a wonderful piece of fan fiction. Then in addition to that, there are astrological diagrams. So here we're looking at Pisces. You see the two fish in the middle, and someone, a later owner or annotator, has actually written the name of the month in the center of these diagrams. Here it says MARS for March. So that's just one example of the kind of evidence that we find in the manuscript that helps us to piece together its history and its ownership. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. This is my favorite part of the manuscript. This is balneological, biological diagrams, naked ladies in ponds with swords. I'm kidding, no swords in the ladies in the watery ponds. So here we've got these women in these pools with waterworks. And then on this side, we have what appear to be biological diagrams of some kind, perhaps having to do with women's health, gynecology, or obstetrics. And this also ties in very nicely with the fanfic that Ray had mentioned before. The author clearly did their homework in thinking about this as a book for a female audience. The next section is just this one sheet, a very large foldout in 9 sections that is completely unique and really unintelligible. There are a lot of people with strong feelings about what this diagram symbolizes, but I'm not yet convinced by any of the discussions that I've seen. The next section, you have groups of plants, roots, stems, leaves, some text, and vessel. So this looks like perhaps recipes that where you combine these plants in this way and put them in this vessel, and you come up with some kind of medicine or some kind of treatment for something. And then the very last section is purely textual, just these paragraphs with stars along the edges. And so that's it. So that's the contents of the manuscript. Because we can't read it, all we can do is make assumptions based on the illustrations and what it appears to be. We just don't know what it actually is. The next thing I want to do is walk you through the letter forms, the lettering system. So there are about, what have I listed here? 26, is that right? 20, yes. So I've listed here the 26 most common symbols in the manuscript. And there are some of these from the top left, the most common up here down to the most rare. But there were also some other symbols like this that appear to be combinations or ligatures. Not entirely sure yet how to unpack what's happening with these particular symbols. It's something that I'm interested in as I move forward with my own research. I am a paleographer. That's my subspecialty in medieval studies. And paleography is a part of the medievalist toolkit. It literally means ancient handwriting. And what paleographers do, there are several different things. The first is attribution. We are trained to look at a medieval handwriting, at a medieval script, and tell you when it was written and where it was written based on the style of the letters, the letter forms. And you do that by comparing an unknown sample to samples that have a known date and place of origin. So that's the first thing. The second thing is literacy. We teach our students how to read medieval scripts, some of which are not at all similar to Latin scripts that we might see today. And I'm only talking about Latin paleography, the paleography of Latin, the Latin alphabet. And then finally, description. So distinguishing one scribe from another by looking very carefully at particular letter forms and thinking about how the pen moves. That's called the ductus, and how one scribe makes this letter form versus how a different scribe makes the same letter form. Now, when we're talking about Voynich paleography, we can't use the comparative method to come up with a date and place of origin because this type of script, this lettering system, is unknown. It's not known anywhere else. So that's out the door. We can't do that. And we can't do literacy, obviously, because we can't read the damn thing. So we're left with description. And that's the kind of work that I have been doing on the manuscript. I have been trying to distinguish how many different people contributed to the writing, the actual literal writing with the quill of the manuscript. Now that's different from authorship. I'm not talking about authorship. I'm just talking about the person who had the pen in hand and the ink and is doing the writing. Someone else might have been dictating what they were writing, or each of these scribes might have been an intellectual author. That is definitely not what I mean. I'm literally just talking about the person doing the writing. So I'll show you sort of how this works. So here we are looking at folios. Hold on, let me move this. There we go. We're looking at folio 31 verso on the left, folio 32 on the right. And if we zoom in, you can see by the naked eye that these are two different hands. The one on the right, which is known as scribe 1, is very broad, neat, widely spaced, one, dare I say, legible, as opposed to scribe 2 on the left, which is much more cramped, narrow, has the line slope upwards. They're very clearly distinguishable. And this distinction between scribe 1 and scribe 2 was actually first made about 40 years ago by a Voynichologist named Prescott Currier. And Currier distinguished scribe 1 and scribe 2, but didn't have a whole lot of success identifying the other scribes of the manuscript. And so I have picked up where Currier left off to try and complete the division of the manuscript into different scribes. And in my own work that I've published, I've come up with 5 different scribes: Currier's 1 and 2, and then 3 more, which I have cleverly named scribes 3, 4, and 5. And the way that you distinguish them is not just by the general appearance, but by looking at some particular letter forms. So this one right here, this finial that loops over, is quite different from one scribe to the next, and is actually a very good way, just from that single letter form, to distinguish the different scribes, because they're quite consistent about how they do that finial, that loop at the end. So you can see scribe 1, it's very broad and long, but tall, whereas scribe 5, it's low. And scribe 3, it's short and tight and nearly closed. So that seems to be sufficient to distinguish these scribes. So before I go on, I'm going to take you very quickly through how medieval manuscripts are structured, because this is really important for understanding the history of this manuscript. This is a kind of generic diagram taken from Barbara Shaler's fantastic book, The Medieval Book. And in this, you see the fundamental unit of a medieval manuscript is a page, a sheet of parchment or paper folded in half to create 2 sheets, 2 leaves. And the 2 that are connected on a single sheet, that's called a bifolium. A bifolium consists of 2 folios or 2 folia, 2 sheets, and each of those has 2 sides, which are the pages. So, and those are recto, which is the first side you come to when you're reading, and the verso on the other side. And when you take all of these bifolia and you fold them and you nest them and you sew them through the middle to create little notebooks that are called quires. And this is important because how it, when you see how it relates to the structure of the manuscript. So I'll show you how this works. So here we're looking at 28 verso on the left and folio 29 recto on the right. And you can actually see right here a thread, the sewing thread going right through the middle. So we know this is the central bifolium of the quire. So that's how this looks. And this is written by scribe 1. So that's how this works. And then we have a little diagram there on the left. So here's our bifolium, folio 28 and 29. And here's how it looks in this schematic diagram. And both of them are written by scribe 1, all 4 sides, both folios and the whole bifolium, all written by scribe 1. Here comes the next bifolio, fold it and nest it, and it's also written by scribe 1. That's totally sensible. Now, when we get to the next bifolium, which is folio 26 and folio 31, which are a single sheet of parchment shown here, we zoom in, we see now that this is actually written by scribe 2. The whole bifolium, all 4 pages, both sides of both sheets are written by scribe 2. Now, those of you who have some experience with medieval manuscripts are right now going, wait, really? That's weird. It is weird. It's extremely weird, even by Voynich standards. And I will show you why in a moment after we look at the very last one. So now we're looking at 25 and 32 together, fold them, and that's scribe 1 again. So we've got 4 folded, nested bifolia to create a quire. And in that quire, one of the bifolia is entirely written by scribe 2, and the rest of them are written by scribe 1. And that's just not how medieval manuscripts work. You might expect a whole quires written by a single scribe, and then another quire written by different scribes. Or you might expect that you might have the first 3 folios written by one scribe, and then it changes for the rest. But to have a whole bifolio nested together with bifolia written by a different scribe is really strange and totally unexpected. And the implication is that the bifolia are actually not in their original sequence anymore, that they're bound out of order. And there's lots of other evidence about this too. So this is the first piece of evidence that tells us something about the history of the manuscript. Now, when we look at, if we look at this page, we'll see some more evidence, some more physical evidence about the manuscript. So here we're looking at folio 13. And if you look very closely at this number, you'll see that it's on top of this very catastrophic water stain. So the stain happened before the folio numbers were added. Now we also have right here a stub telling us perhaps that something has gone missing. And if we go back one page, we will see there's folio 11 and the next one is folio 13. So the folio numbered 12 is in fact gone missing. So now we know several things about the physical history of the manuscript. There was a catastrophic water stain, which was probably why the manuscript was taken apart and rebound at some point. And then the folio numbers were added to the upper right corner. And then folio 12 and other leaves were lost, were cut out and removed. So that's the kind of evidence that we look for, the kind of physical evidence that tells us something about the history of the manuscript and the changes that it's been through. Now, before I pass it over to Claire, I'm going to introduce you to one of the methods that humanists and scientists use to approach this manuscript. A computer cannot read Voynichese. So what Voynichologists do is you use a substitution alphabet to replace Voynich characters with ASCII characters. So using, in this case, what's called the EVA, or the extensible Voynich alphabet. And so, for example, here's a nice Voynich word, which using this substitution is OKOR. It's really important to remember that this is not an O, that is not a K, and that is not an R. That is not what EVA is. EVA is just a relatively arbitrary substitution that allows you to transcribe the manuscript in ASCII characters. So you end up with something that looks like this. And this is from Renee Zandbergen's transcription of the manuscript. And once you have this, then you can start digging into the linguistics of the manuscript. And that's what Claire is going to talk about. And then the very last thing I want to say is that at the same time that Prescott Currier in the 70s made this distinction between scribe 1 and scribe 2, he also observed that there are different patterns of the use of Voynich symbols between scribe 1 and scribe 2. And he referred to those as language A and language B. They're not really different enough to be different languages, so I prefer to use the term dialect. But that's something that Claire can talk about as well. So here's one example of how Voynichese differs in dialect A from dialect B. So here's scribe 1, you see this character relatively frequently on this page, whereas it's hardly found at all in scribe 2. And then another example that's much more dramatic is this suffix. So these two Voynichese letters that look like 8, 9, but in EVA, they're transcribed as DY. That is incredibly frequent in the work of scribes 2, 3, 4, and 5 at the end of words, but it's incredibly rare over here with in scribe 1 dialect A. I don't know what it means, but I'm going to pass it over to Claire, who may be able to tell us more. All right, Claire, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lisa, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to be talking just a little bit about some aspects of the text itself. And so when we think about the Voynich manuscript, there are of course many ways, many avenues that we can get into unraveling the history. Of course, not literally unraveling. We don't want to do that with a medieval object, but we can examine the physical book itself. We can look at the pages, the binding, the ink. I see in the Q&A there's been lots of questions about the carbon dating, for instance. So that's one source of inquiry. We also have, of course, the script and its properties, which Lisa has been talking about, and so the number of scribes involved in the manufacturing process of the book, and what sort of relationships that script might have to other known writing systems. But we can also look at things like the text and the illustrations, and we can look at the patterns that we see in the language itself. So rather than looking at the forms of the glyphs of the script, we can look at the patterns of those glyphs, those letters, if you like, figure out whether they are letters of an alphabet or some other type of writing system, and look at what sort of meaning there might be, or indeed no meaning underlying the text in the manuscript itself. And that's where I come in. So I'm a linguist. I'm a professor in the linguistics department here at Yale, and my job is basically working with languages that don't have reference books, grammars, dictionaries, and so on, and analyzing those languages to figure out the structural properties of those languages, and then of course use that information in how languages change over time and how we can look at the extent of differences across human languages across the world. So Lisa, if we go on to the next slide. So you might be thinking, well, we can't read the Voynich manuscript, so what can we say about the linguistic system? So if we're studying Latin, for instance, we can look at the prefixes and suffixes in Latin. We can look at the grammar of the text and figure out stuff about Latin from that. But if we can't read Voynichese, what can we say about the grammar of Voynichese without having the meaning underneath it? But in fact, there's quite a lot that we can tell about a language that, even if we don't know anything about the meanings of the words that underlie it. So, for instance, we can work out quite a lot about the sound system of a language, even if we can't pronounce the script. So we can say whether the sound system of a language like Voynichese is most likely writing syllables, or whether it's writing individual letters, whether it's like Hebrew and Arabic just writing consonants, or whether it's some other sort of system. We can look at the prefixes and suffixes of the word structure of Voynichese and compare that to other known languages. There were some questions in the Q&A about have we looked at comparisons with Celtic, or have we looked at comparisons with other languages? In the interests of time, I'll be talking about some other types of comparisons, but I'm happy to talk about that in the question period. And so looking at these sorts of structural properties, so looking at the grammar independently of the meanings of words, in short, thinking like a linguist about language is one way among many that we can get into the Voynich manuscript. And I thought I would just talk about one aspect of the work that I've been doing. So Lisa, if we go to the next slide, we can look at, so there are many possible aspects of language structure that we can look at. And so I'm just going to take one example here, looking at the sequences of letters, of characters in the Voynich script, and how they compare with other languages. There were questions in the Q&A as well about this. Q&A is really on fire. It's awesome. About whether we can tell whether something is enciphered, or whether it's gibberish, or whether it's another language that isn't known. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. We could also look at words and sequences of words, and if there's time in the the question period, I can talk a little bit about that as well. But what I'm going to talk about today is called H2 entropy, so second order conditional entropy. We can think of this as a measure of predictability in a script. So if you think about English, first of all, so forget about Voynichese for a second, but just think about how we write English words. If I start writing an English word and I start writing S, then you don't really know what letter I'm going to write next, right? It could be any one of quite a number of letters, not all 26 letters of the alphabet, because we don't have words in English that start with SB, for instance, but we have SA, we have SC, we don't really have SD, but we have SE, so SA as in sat or SE as in set. SI as in sit, etc. And so the predictability of the second letter in a S plus something sequence is not very high, right? But if we compare that to a letter like Q in English, then if I start a word with Q, then it's not 100% guaranteed, but it's pretty likely that the next letter is going to be U, right? So we have lots of letters, lots of words that have a sequence QU, but the letters, the words where there's Q and something else, like what, Qantas or Qatar, and so on. There are very few words like that. So we can look at the predictability of letters in context in different writing systems and in different languages, and use that to get a profile of a language and of a script. So in conjunction with a former student, now postdoc, Luke Lindemann, we've been looking at comparing Voynichese to other languages and other writing systems to get a sense of how unusual the Voynich script is and whether we can identify any aspects of the language or language family or writing system or encipherment method on that basis. And the first thing to note is that the Voynich manuscript Voynichese is much more predictable than other languages. So I've circled the measures, the average measures for the Voynich samples. So this is language A, language B, and Voynichese as a whole. And they're the three dots here. So the lower this H2 number, the more predictable the script is. Okay, and up here, all the other dots are all the other languages we looked at. So we had samples. These are individual texts. So we had a mixture of modern and ancient samples. We looked at a number of different writing systems, and you can see that Voynichese looks quite different from other systems. So Lisa, if we can go to the next slide. So that of course raises questions. So if the Voynich manuscript is so different, then does that point us to gibberish? So is there no actual language underlying the script, or is it rather a code or a cipher where the encipherment mechanism has obscured the underlying language and made it look very different from a natural language? Or is it an unknown language, a language that is not enciphered, but a language that we don't have any other records of? And the fact that Voynichese is so different from all of the other natural languages we've looked at, and actually all of many constructed languages as well, like Esperanto and Klingon, we included those samples to see what that might do to the H2 measures. We can rule out, I think, unknown language as a simple answer to this question. So rather we're looking at either something like gibberish or something like code. Now the gibberish or hoax idea, I'm not going to talk about here, but I have actually in the Yale Alumni Association, Alumni Academy talk last Friday, I went into some detail about why I don't think gibberish is the right way to think about the manuscript. So here I want to look at ways in which we could potentially manipulate this H2, this predictability measure, and what that might do to the language. And so we're going to look at a couple of different things. So abbreviations, first of all. So if we abbreviate text, this has been a claim for the Voynich manuscript as well, what does that do to H2? Or if we segment characters differently. So rather than treating the 4 plus O in scare quotes as one character versus two characters. What sort of thing does that, like maybe we're segmenting the scripts incorrectly. We could look at variable spelling, and we could look at ciphers as well. So the next couple of diagrams is just going to continue doing that. So Lisa, if we go to the next slide. So first of all, let's look at Voynich character segmentation. So what we did here was we played with various ways of segmenting the script by taking maximally segmented items and minimally segmented items. And you can see that this does actually affect the H2 measures. So it does make the reading, the measurements letters more or less predictable, as you can imagine. So if we treat 4, 0 as a single character, then 4 becomes less predictable, right? Because it's no longer followed by O, and so that lowers the predictability of the language overall. Okay, so you can see that there is a range here of measures, but even the highest measure is still quite a bit lower than our natural language measures. So we get things in the range here of 1.8 to 2.6, but most of our natural language measures were in, say, roughly 3 to 4. Okay, so that's this is segmentation on its own without other manipulation is not going to help. Lisa, if we can go on to the next one. So, oh, sorry, this is difficult to read, but this is looking at abbreviations. What we did was we took common abbreviations as found in scribal practice in medieval text, and we applied those to unabbreviated Latin text and compared the entropy measures. And basically what happens is nothing. So the abbreviated Latin has a similar set of entropy levels. In fact, the H2 levels are slightly higher, so it's actually slightly less predictable than the unabbreviated Latin. And you can see there's clear segmentation here between the all our Voynich samples, which are in blue at the bottom, and the abbreviated set. So that's not going to help. So Lisa, if we go on to the next example, here is another scatter plot that shows, in this case, ciphers. So we tried a number of different cipher methods that are both a combination of ciphers that were known at the time and other things that we predicted would manipulate the entropy, the H2 measures in various ways. So for instance, we used this ALF is short for alfalfa. So we tried a Pig Latin alfalfa type of encipherment. And so that takes characters and it inserts predictable information after it, okay? And so as you can imagine, that lowers H2 substantially because now after basically every segment, there's a predictable segment. We also did things like sorting all the characters in words in alphabetical order, or we collapsed various meaningful distinctions in Latin. We did all of this based on a range of Latin texts, but we could do it with other languages as well. And so you can see, so the Voynich dots here are in white. I'm sorry they don't come over so well on the slides, but yeah. So our Voynich measures are between like 2 and 2.5 or so. Our encipherment methods do produce mostly entropy measures that are above this, but some of them get down into Voynich ranges. And so Lisa, if we go to the next slide. This just zooms in some more detail about the entropy measures that do produce something that looks somewhat like Voynichese. This is of course not a statement that Voynichese was enciphered using one of these methods, but in fact I think some of these methods are actually pretty implausible. So for instance, these pink and purple measures were various ways of converting all the vowels in a text to a single character and all the consonants to another character. And so that makes the text very predictable, but it doesn't make it legible or unencipherable, right? It just produces a whole bunch of CV sequences. Sorting characters in alphabetical order also reduces the entropy to near Voynich levels, but it's not, as far as I know, not a practice of encipherment that was known in the medieval period. And so, so where does that leave us? Well, there are various metrics that we can use to evaluate Voynichese in relation to other characters and various claims that have been made about how these languages, or how Voynich might have been composed. So we looked at abbreviations, we looked at encipherment, we looked at various ranges of natural languages, and certainly abbreviation does not produce the character metrics that we would like to see for entropy levels. We looked at, so abbreviation no range of natural or constructed language that we looked at has measures like the Voynich manuscript. Some methods of encipherment do have measures that approach this. So this might be a promising line of inquiry. We also found that it was quite significant how the script was divided. And so treating some characters as a single character versus splitting those characters does influence the entropy measures, as would be expected. And so this is a promising line of inquiry. At this point, let me just say one more thing about the linguistics of the manuscript, and actually pre-answer one of the questions. There was a question in the Q&A about Yannick and Tucker and various theories about individual languages and manuscript locations. And so roughly every 6 months to a year, there's a new claim about the Voynich manuscript has been deciphered, and it doesn't take very long for various people to point out difficulties with those claims. And Lisa is someone who has done her fair share of pointing out both the difficulties in producing a coherent theory of what the Voynich manuscript is, and in I think it's Nick Pelling's words, it's quite difficult to come up with a theory that takes into account all the many different aspects of Voynichese without pretty obviously losing the train of reasoning quickly, and thereby coming a cropper, making big mistakes quickly. And so I think this is one of the so I'm just going to pick on the Nahuatl, the Yannick and Tucker theory for this, but I think many Voynich theories suffer from similar issues, that they take one aspect of the text, peculiarities of the illustrations, this kind of quasi-familiarity and yet unfamiliarity with the illustrations, the familiarity of some aspects of the script and yet very unfamiliar, unlike aspects of the script that are very unlike languages that we're more familiar with, like Latin or Greek, and then say, oh, okay, so in that case, maybe the manuscript comes from, say, from Mexico. Maybe it's Nahuatl, or maybe it's an Aztec manuscript. And of course, we do have samples from the early 16th century of Aztec herbals and manuscripts that bear maybe some superficial similarity to the Voynich manuscript. And here's where the chain of reasoning falls down. So the carbon dating, the radiocarbon dating, clearly places the manuscript in the early 15th century. And there's some, of course, some uncertainty in interpreting carbon dates because of the calibration points. But if anything, the choices for the Voynich manuscript are between late 14th century and early 15th century choices, rather than early 15th century and early 16th century manuscripts, which is what the Voynich manuscript would have to be. So as far as I'm concerned, a Nahuatl origin of the manuscript is a non-starter on the basis of the physical document itself. But when we look at the linguistic, yeah.
And that's what often happens, right? Is that people, they, like you said, they latch onto one piece of it. So they're really interested in the plants. So they base their entire theory on what they think about the plants without taking into account the actual facts, things that we actually know about the manuscript. And any solution or reading of the manuscript has to be consistent with what we know to be true. You have to be able to explain why there are these variations in different parts of the manuscript. What does it mean that there are multiple scribes? What does it mean, how do you account for the entropy if you're going to decipher it? Is it hidden? Is it some kind of secret? Or is it simply a transcription in a language, that was spoken? What what happens all the time is someone either says, I looked at the manuscript for 2 days and I had a revelation, I had an aha moment, and here's what it is. Okay, maybe you got lucky, maybe you were right, but let's go back and examine that methodology. Let's take it apart in a scientific way and look at what your methodology was. What are the assumptions that you made to begin with? What are the steps that you took? How did you get to your conclusions? It's not enough if your conclusion might make sense. There are a lot of theories out there that end up at the Mediterranean, the northern Mediterranean, or Germany. There are that seem like a perfectly reasonable solution or a perfectly reasonable answer. But if you don't start with the facts, your conclusion is going to be suspect and is not going to hold up under scrutiny.
Yep, I absolutely agree, and that goes for the claims of particular languages as well. So, for instance, if you claim that, or if someone claims that this is Nahuatl, then you better know quite a lot about Nahuatl grammar, not take a couple of words in citation forms and say that this is Nahuatl. Actually, speaking of knowing about languages, there was a comment in the Q&A about medieval Latin not being a single entity. Yes, as someone with a degree in classics, I'm well aware that medieval Latin is not a single entity. But the point is that the abbreviation process, whatever abbreviations you do, what sort of things that does to the entropy, and they all raise the entropy. So it doesn't actually matter. So for our purposes. So for scribal purposes, yes, it definitely matters what is being abbreviated and how and so on. For our purposes, for what it does to the to character predictability, it doesn't. Any of the practices in use produce the same sort of result.
So I want to, I see someone asked a question about paleographical methodology, that in fact, you're absolutely right. The question is, if you write the letter W 5 times, they are going to be slightly different. And how do you make those distinctions? How do you know when it is actually a different person writing as opposed to the same person writing in a slightly different way? And you're absolutely right that there are, obviously, these are written by human beings. And, when I make an ampersand, I make it always using the same motion, even if the letter form itself might look slightly different. But it's the way that the pen moves that is the key to making those distinctions. And if we had more time, I would show you what I mean. But there are places where you can tell that a scribe has lifted the pen before making the next stroke. And then there are other scribes who don't lift the pen before going for the next stroke. And those are things that don't change. No matter, even if the two letter forms look slightly different from one another, they're maybe slightly bigger, there's a smaller loop, or they're slightly at a different angle, the ductus, the way that the pen moves, is going to be consistent in one hand. So that's how I make those distinctions. But it is a question of judgment. It is not science. It's not a hard and fast fact. It's my opinion based on my experience and I've been a paleographer for 30 years. I've looked at thousands of medieval manuscripts and studied them, and I teach this. And so based on my own experience and my own judgment, other people may have different opinions, and I'm always open to refining my conclusions. And that's where my collaboration with Claire has been so helpful to me, because some of her work has been to test my the work that I've done, and vice versa. So we really have helped each other as we've moved forward in our own work, which has been really satisfying and very exciting. and we have, 80 questions, and we have to end in a few minutes, and so we can't get to all of them.
Yeah, actually, can I answer one about, so Irvin Schick had a question about, so the low entropy level strikes Irvin as evidence of fabricatedness. And so if you make up a random series of letters and numbers, you'll find that it's much more predictable than a truly random sequence. I think this is an awesome question because it brings up a lot of things about what we mean when we talk about random, like random as truly random versus random as in what humans create as random. We tested this in the class that I teach on the Voynich manuscript. We one of the things we did was, okay, what does human created random non-language designed to look like language look like? And so one of the things we looked at was, we had students, so I have about 40 samples of this now over a couple of years of classes. We got them producing producing random non-language to look like language. And what we found was that the entropy levels of that vary quite a lot, but even so, they are still mostly higher than the Voynich manuscript. And that we think is because it's actually really difficult for humans to create non-language like content. What they do is they try and they either base it on other languages they know, or they take things that are still pronounceable, or they do sequences of letters and they try and make it deliberately different. And so these, of course, mostly wash out. But the end result is still something that has high H2 values than Voynich's, which in itself is very, very striking, and may argue to a combination of deliberate deliberate obfuscation, and perhaps we're segmenting segmenting the units of the writing system in an incorrect way.
So I'd just like to interrupt. Lisa made a very generous offer, and you can find that in the chat. She said she will answer more questions on Twitter. Check #Voynich if you're on Twitter. It's one of the things I love about Lisa is the woman is fearless. And so she will respond, she'll reply to all of you.
I'll do my best.
Well, no, not reply to all of you, but she does reply, which is, given all the work that she's doing, is absolutely amazing. Claire, I love what you're doing with this stuff, and I love that you've had your students do it. And I love that those students are then going on and publishing papers, and it just speaks to the amazing wealth. I think so many people have seen this manuscript as kind of a sideshow, sort of a freak thing, and yet clearly, in your own teaching, you have shown how it can really instruct students. And I've seen the conference you put on with the students presenting, and how, if nothing else, it forces them to think about their assumptions of what the Middle Ages is and how language works. And I'm incredibly grateful to you for your scholarship. And Lisa, your field is most close to mine. So you're the one that, when you come up with these things, I'm like, oh, another author, or another scribe, you've completely ruined what hypothesis I've had about this manuscript. My own hypothesis was like one person was trying to fool somebody else and wrote it. But when you've got 5 scribes, screws that one up. So I won't be making any money on that. Thanks to everyone in the comments. I've tried to answer as fast as I could, but it really is hard to, rapid fire back all of that. So if I've made mistakes, please be charitable and forgive me. I saw E.C. Schroeder was out there. E.C., thanks for tuning in and for your encouragement in publishing the facsimile. And again, thank you to Michael Morand and to Claire Bowern and Lisa Fagin Davis. And now I guess off to Twitter. And thank you all very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful summer.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm going to take it over to Twitter and we'll see what we can do.
Right. Yep. I'll be over there too for at least a bit. So.